Thank you very, very much. It's great to be back at St. Paul's. This is, I think, my third talk here, although none in recent years. The first was in 1983, when I came to give a talk to pupils. And I was reminded of that occasion in 2010. In 2010, just before the general election, I organised a campaign to challenge the Conservative Party over the fact that they were going into that election without any LGBT policies. They were the only major party to have no policies on LGBT issues. So I issued a challenge to David Cameron, and as a result, he invited me to meet George Osborne and Theresa May to discuss my concerns and to set out what kinds of LGBT policies we'd like to see in the Conservative Party's manifesto. There were several, one of which was making LGBT issues part of sex and relationship education and ensuring that it was included in personal, social, and health education. Designed, of course, to combat prejudice, to help reduce bullying and the victimization of LGBT kids in school. The other big issue we raised was, of course, the legalization of same-sex marriage, to end the ban that, at that time, prohibited same-sex partners from marrying the person they loved. We had quite a long, sometimes contested conversation with George Osborne and Theresa May, but nevertheless, they went away and they said they were going to digest and report back on those proposals. As I was going to leave, George Osborne said to me, "It's very nice to meet you again, Peter." To which I thought to myself, we have never met any time in the past. And he said, "Oh, don't you remember? You came to my school, St. Paul's, in 1983. It made me feel really ancient. To which my response was, "Ah, yes, I do remember, George. You obviously didn't listen to a word I said because you've turned out to be a Tory." Anyway, the upshot was that the Conservatives did put in their ancillary LGBT manifesto for that election that they would consider ending the ban on same-sex marriage. And we had about a 3-year fight to eventually get them to agree it. But that was the antecedents of the legislation that eventually happened. It was out of that meeting. Anyway, back to my story. My 50 years of human rights and LGBT rights campaigning. Nothing about my past prepared me for the life that I have chosen. I was born in Melbourne, Australia in 1952, and I grew up in a period of very illiberal government and of anti-communist witch hunts. Anybody who espoused any kind of liberal progressive values was denounced as a communist or being a fellow traveller. This was Australia's version of McCarthyism. My parents were working class, ultra-conservative, evangelical Christians. My father was a factory worker. My mother was a housewife and sometimes worked in the local biscuit factory. But they had no social conscience at all. Everything in our family revolved around the family and the church. That was it. They were not engaged in the community in any way. They didn't think that was right or appropriate. For them, it was all about praying and doing the right thing, visiting the relatives. It was a very suffocating, confined family life. If any of you have ever seen Jeanette Winterson's film or read her book, Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, that's very, very similar to the kind of family in which I grew up. There were only 3 books in our house: the Bible, an atlas, and a book of Bible prophecies. My parents had no interest in current affairs or politics or human rights. But on the positive side, being the devout quasi-fundamentalists they were, they did teach me that I should always speak out for what I believed to be right, to not follow the mob, to not go along with things because everybody else was doing it, to be questioning and critical. But of course they meant it in religious terms. They meant in terms of being a good, devout Christian and not going ahead with or falling in with people who didn't follow Christian values. I was supposed to speak out against, drinking, smoking, sex before marriage. That was supposed to be my witness. But of course I interpreted this idea of standing up for what is right in a much broader way. Now, I believed that it wasn't just about your own personal life and things about sexual morality. It was about much bigger issues about social inequality, racism, and so on. So, already from about the age of 12 or 13, I began to sort of be questioning and be thinking beyond anything my parents had ever taught me or engaged with. At the time when I was growing up in Australia in the 1950s and early 1960s, there was no equivalent to the National Health Service. There was no social medical health care at all. And my mother had chronic life-threatening asthma. So it fell to me from about the age of 8 onwards to look after my younger half-brother and 2 half-sisters. I had to do the cooking, the cleaning, the bottle feeding, the nappy changing, get my younger brother ready for school, all those kind of things. Not all the time, but for the considerable periods when my mother was ill and unable to do anything. So I had a very, very sharp learning curve. I can remember the first time I ever tried to cook a meal. Those vegetables were just like mash or mush. But I learned, and the first time I tried to boil an egg, it came out so hard-boiled it was inedible. But, over time I learned. And it made me very independent and resourceful. Whenever, other kids were going out playing, I was often at home doing the laundry, washing up, making a meal, cleaning up after the meal. It did restrict my playtime, and I did sort of feel that I lost out. But also I felt quite proud and that I was doing something that was important, because my father was out working all hours of the night and day, because, with no medical insurance, with no National Health Service, a lot of our family income went on medical bills for my mother. So even by working class standards, we were very, very poor and life was very tough, and my father had to work very long hours. But it gave me a sense of responsibility. I also remember that I was born a few years after the end of the Second World War, and many of my childhood comics, books and films had war themes. So I remember about the age of perhaps 10 or 11, I'd be asking adults, why did people allow Hitler to get to power? Why didn't people see what was coming? Why didn't they take action to stop him before he got power and before he did all these terrible things? And of course, no one could give me a satisfactory answer. But I remember thinking to myself, well, if ever there was a Hitler or some other great injustice in my lifetime, I wouldn't just look the other way. I wouldn't just walk on by. I'd try and do something. And I suppose you can see that was very much coming out of my devout Christian upbringing, the parable of the Good Samaritan, the idea that we are our brothers and sisters' keeper. Those kind of values, I interpreted them in a much more wider social way rather than simply about personal salvation. The first real political awareness I had was in 1963 when I was aged 11. I saw reports about the racist bombing of a black church in Birmingham, Alabama, in the United States, where 4 young girls about my own age were killed in a bombing of that church. I can remember thinking to myself, aged 11, how could anyone kill another human being, let alone 4 young girls in church on a Sunday morning? I was just utterly shocked, appalled, and devastated. I took it to heart really personally. And that prompted my interest in Martin Luther King and the Black Civil Rights Movement. I immediately saw this was a grave injustice and that African Americans were right, heroic and inspirational in the way they were challenging that kind of racial persecution. But my actual campaigning didn't start until a number of years later, until 1967, when I was 15, when I got involved in the campaign to protest the hanging of an alleged killer, Ronald Ryan. Now, Ronald Ryan had been a prisoner in Melbourne's main jail, and he'd escaped from prison and had allegedly shot dead a warder during that escape. But I remember reading a summary of the autopsy report on the dead warder's body, which showed the trajectory of the bullet. And I worked out that where Ronald Ryan was allegedly standing when he fired the fatal shot, and where the warder was standing when he was hit, it would have been almost physically impossible for him to have fired that fatal bullet. Plus, there was evidence in the trial from another warder who said that he suspected, he didn't know for certain, but he suspected that maybe the warder had actually been shot by another warder in one of the watchtowers when he accidentally moved into the line of fire. And that would have fitted with the trajectory of the bullet through the dead warder's body. So that convinced me that there was at least a reasonable doubt that Ronald Ryan was guilty. Beside the issue of whether there should be capital punishment, for me, there was a realistic doubt that he was guilty, and therefore he should not be hanged. In the end, he was hanged anyway. And that completely destroyed my trust and confidence in the authorities, in the government, the police, the courts. I thought to myself, how could they order the hanging of a man where there was disputed evidence and where there was at least reasonable doubt that he fired that fatal shot? It made me a lifelong skeptic of authority. I thought to myself, if they're prepared to do this, what else are they doing that I don't know about? So I began to look into the history of the dispossession of the indigenous Aboriginal peoples from Australia. How the process of English colonisation had forced them out of the lands they traditionally inhabited and basically made them non-citizens in their own country. And that enraged me. It enraged me to think that black Australians, whose country it was, had been treated so badly. Now there's a big dispute, but some estimates suggest that when the first white people arrived in Australia, there were up to, perhaps not quite, but up to 750,000 Indigenous Australians and Torres Strait Islanders. By the 1920s, the numbers had fallen to about 120,000. That is a de facto genocide. And I was appalled that in school I'd never been taught this. My family, my church never talked about it. How could we sit as conquerors, I mean not us directly, but our forebears, sit as conquerors in this land where the indigenous peoples have been treated so badly? It also opened up my eyes to Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War. At that time, Australia was fighting alongside the Americans, ostensibly to prevent a communist takeover. But then I investigated and I found that, according to the agreement, there were supposed to be free and fair elections in Vietnam in 1954. But the United States blocked that because they feared that the people would have voted for Ho Chi Minh and the communists. And that subsequently, the United States, with Australian support, backed a tyrannical, brutal dictatorship in Saigon in a bid to, quote, save South Vietnam for democracy. In fact, they were trampling on democracy, supposedly, in order to save it. At school, all these ideas made me a rebel. I demanded, and with others, with other pupils, that we should have a role or a say in running the school. I remember on the 4th of July 1968, I organized the burning of an American flag in the school playground in protest of the Vietnam War. We organized a big fundraiser and campaign to provide scholarships to Aboriginal children who were forced economically to leave school at the age of 16 to go out to work. You know, not getting the qualifications which I saw as key to the upliftment of Aboriginal peoples. If they could get an education and get qualifications, if we get a new generation of Indigenous Australians with the skills and the professional backgrounds, they could be the spokespeople, the motivators of change in Australia. At school, I wasn't aware of my gayness. I did have very good legs, and some boys used to wolf whistle me. I used to get gentle jibes of Poof to Pete and Peter Pansy, but it didn't upset me because I was confident that I was straight. You know, I was dating girls, and I was very popular and well-liked. In fact, in 1968, under our system at school, the head boy and the head girl were voted for by a mass vote of all the pupils. And I was voted boys' school captain in 1968. That year, age 16, I had to leave school to get a job to help the family income. You know, my stepfather was working really, really hard, but, you know, he wanted and the family needed me to go out and earn money so that I wasn't a burden, but I was a contributor to the family well-being. My passion was art and design. I wanted to work in that field, but of course, my parents couldn't afford me to send me to art school or university, so I had no qualifications. So what I settled for was working in the design and display department of a big department store in Melbourne, where I learned on the job, you know, sign writing, window displays, interior design, advertising, and so on. And that's where I first met gay people, and eventually, about a year later, realized that I was gay and fell in love age 17. That was in 1969. In late 1969, I read a report about gay protests in New York. Not the Stonewall protests, but the subsequent ones that took place later that year. And I decided that I wanted to be part of the battle for LGBT liberation. I've been championing the rights of Indigenous Australians, you know, the campaign against the Vietnam War, the battle against the death penalty, but now this is an issue that affected me personally. And I wanted to continue all these other battles, but also work for LGBT liberation as well. At that time, there were no gay rights organisations in Melbourne. Not even any helplines or counselling services. Absolutely nothing. So of course, I wanted to set up a gay rights organisation. I said, this is what we like the people in New York who are marching, we need to march here, because in those days, in the state of Victoria and most of the other states in Australia, homosexuality was still illegal. You could get several years imprisonment and even be subjected to enforced psychiatric treatment. So I wanted to do something. Now, I didn't have a template, I didn't have a model. I'd read about these reports in the protest in New York, but I didn't know anything about them and who was organising them, how they organised and whatever. So I had no mentors, no template, no model. So what I did was reflect on the Black Civil Rights Movement in America. And I drew lessons from that. I concluded as this rather immature 17-year-old that gay people were an oppressed minority just like black people in America. And that just like them, we as LGBT people had a right and a claim for justice and equal treatment. So off the back of that, I concluded that the tactics of non-violent direct action and civil disobedience, as exemplified by Martin Luther King and others, that was going to be the template, the model for the battle for LGBT equality. Because it was clear at that stage and for many years afterwards that people in power and authority would not listen to reason or compassion. Their minds were closed, their hearts were closed, their doors were closed. And so we would have to use similar tactics to the Black Civil Rights Movement in order to bring about that change. I reasoned also, based on the experience of the Black Civil Rights Movement, that it would probably take about 50 years to win LGBT equality in countries like Australia, Britain, and the United States. I had no idea that I was almost going to be right. In 1971, I left Australia to come to London, partly because I'd always wanted to travel, but partly because I objected to the war in Vietnam and was not prepared to be drafted. If I'd stayed in Australia and continued to refuse to register for national service, I would have faced 2 years imprisonment. Perhaps I should have done that. In fact, certainly I should have done that, but I'd just fallen in love and got a new relationship. The idea of us being torn apart by 2 years in prison seemed too much for me to bear. So I came to London with my partner in 1971. And on the very second day I was here in London, on a lamppost near Oxford Circus, I saw a sticker advertising the meetings of the newly formed Gay Liberation Front. I thought, wow, this is what I want to do. I won't stop the other campaigning, but I really want to get involved with an LGBT organisation that will fight for my personal liberation. And in the Gay Liberation Front, I was often known as, quote, action man. And I was always trying to look at ways in which to do effective action, and always reflecting back on the Black Civil Rights Movement. So in late 1971, when it became apparent that there were a number of pubs in mostly West London, but even some in central London, that refused to serve LGBT people, I proposed that we should use the Black Civil Rights Movement tactic of sit-ins. We should sit in and demand to be served. And that is what we did. We sat in at pubs and restaurants that refused to serve LGBT people and refused to leave. And initially, the police were called, we were evicted, but after we began to do it on a regular basis, very quickly those businesses decided it was more trouble than it was worth in order to stop us. That stopping us was more trouble than it was worth. So they caved in. So we won, within a matter of weeks, victories all over different parts of London. It shows, I think, that we can all learn from different struggles. That, look at what others have done before. The Chartists, the suffragettes, the Black Civil Rights Movement. That's been my whole history because, as I said, I had no mentors, no template. So I looked to past struggles and adapted the ideas, the methods, and so on to the contemporary campaigns that I've been involved in. I just want to briefly give you a flavour of some of those campaigns, and this is not an exhaustive list by any means. I think over the last 50 years I've been involved in over 3,000 direct action protests, many of them involving civil disobedience, actually breaking the law in order to challenge unjust authority. I've been arrested somewhere in the region of about 200 times, but I only have one standing conviction, and that was for the Canterbury Cathedral protest in 1998. For those who don't know, in 1998, myself and 6 members of the LGBT group Outrage walked into the pulpit of the then Archbishop of Canterbury, George Carey, on Easter Sunday in Canterbury Cathedral. We did that because he was advocating legal discrimination against LGBT people. He was saying the law should discriminate because homosexuality is inferior to heterosexuality. Now, my view was, he's entitled to his belief. I'm sorry he holds homophobic views, but we're not going to sit back and allow him to advocate and encourage members of Parliament to vote against LGBT equality. So we tried to have a meeting with him, but he wouldn't. He wouldn't meet with us. In most cases, he wouldn't even reply to our letters. So we decided to take our concerns to him on the most important day of the Christian year, Easter Sunday, when we knew that the cathedral would be packed and when we knew it would be televised around the world. We want to shame George Carey in front of his congregation and in front of Christians around the world. So we did not interrupt any of the sacred parts of the service like prayers. We waited until he began his sermon. And then we calmly walked towards the pulpit. And there were 3 church wardens standing there. So one of my colleagues feigned an asthma attack. Very, very sharp thinking. He feigned an asthma attack, gasping, and the wardens ran over to assist him. Meanwhile, the rest of us just calmly walked into the pulpit. George Carey stepped to one side, and I delivered an impromptu alternative sermon. And the basic theme of it was, discrimination is not a Christian value. That you can have a view that homosexuality is wrong or sinful, but to demand that the criminal law and the civil law discriminates against LGBT people, that is a step too far. That's an abuse of power. That is theocracy, not democracy. And the upshot was that I was arrested and eventually charged with, quote, indecent behaviour in a church, contrary to the Ecclesiastical Courts Jurisdiction Act of 1860, formerly part of the Brawling Act of 1551. And in this legislation, any interruption of a minister of religion in a church is deemed to be, quote, indecent. I didn't drop my trousers or anything like that. It was just, I simply spoke out during his sermon. When it came to the trial, the magistrate accepted that it was a brief protest, that I was peaceful, that I hadn't abused the Archbishop or any member of the congregation, I hadn't said anything hateful against the Christian church. He said it was a good, a reasonable protest. But he said, unfortunately, the law is very clear. Any kind of protest in a church, for any reason, no matter how brief, is illegal. Now, he could have sent me to prison for 6 months or fined me £5,000, but his sentence was a sentence of £18.60. His comical reference to the 1860 Act under which I'd been convicted. So that's my only standing conviction out of about 200 arrests. I've also been assaulted, physically violently assaulted, over 300 times in the last 50 years. Mostly by homophobes, sometimes by supporters of President Mugabe, sometimes by Islamist extremists, and often by far-right people from the National Front, the BNP, the EDL, and so on. And I have got some permanent injuries as a result of that, but I'm here. I've survived. I carry on. In terms of the protests, I just want to briefly skip through. In 1973, when I was part of the Gay Liberation Front in London, I went as a GLF delegate to the 10th Festival of Youth and Students, which was held in what was then communist East Berlin, and staged a series of gay rights protests, where I was arrested and interrogated by the Stasi, but amazingly managed eventually to escape and not suffer any legal consequences. In 1983, I stood as a Labour candidate in the Bermondsey by-election in South East London, as a left-wing pro-gay rights candidate. Most commentators say it was the dirtiest, most violent election, and certainly the most homophobic, in Britain in the 20th century. 150 of those 300 assaults happened when I was standing for Parliament. I'd go out on the doorsteps knocking and canvassing votes. I'd get punched in the face, had bottles bashed over my head, had dogs set on me, you name it. It was a pretty gruesome period. And subsequently, of course, I lost the election. In 1994, with outrage, we named 10 Anglican bishops and called on them to tell the truth, in effect outing them. These were bishops who were part of a church that was explicitly homophobic, that was against the human rights of LGBT people, and which was stirring up prejudice against LGBT people. We did not name them because they were gay and in the closet. It's because of hypocrisy and homophobia. They were part of a church, and they were doing things which colluded with that church's homophobia, despite themselves being gay. Now, we did this, we stood on the steps of the Synod of the Church of England with placards with their names saying, Bishop Michael Marshall, tell the truth. Bishop Timothy Bavin, tell the truth. We were simply saying, you preach that people should tell the truth. Why don't you tell the truth about your sexuality? And why don't you distance yourself from a church that quite clearly is against the human rights of yourself as well as for the wider LGBT community? Now, the consequence of that was that, as far as I know, none of those bishops ever again said anything anti-gay. And in fact, two of them eventually became fantastic allies for the LGBT community. I mentioned Canterbury Cathedral. The upshot of that was that the Archbishop of Canterbury did dramatically reduce his anti-gay statements and his lobbying of MPs to vote against equality. I wouldn't say he stopped, but he did dramatically reduce it. Plus, he agreed to set up the first ever dialogue between the Church of England and the LGBT community. They had always refused any dialogue, but that action prompted that dialogue to begin, and even better, not long afterwards, the House of Bishops was prompted to make a very strong statement in support of LGBT rights. So there were really positive outcomes from that protest. The final example I'll give are the two attempted citizen's arrest of the Zimbabwean dictator Robert Mugabe. The first was in London in 1999 when we ambushed his motorcade in the street near Victoria. I got a tip-off that President Mugabe, a late-night tip-off, an anonymous late-night tip-off by phone, that he was coming to London for a private shopping visit, and that he was staying at the St James's Court Hotel near Victoria. I was told that he was leaving on the Saturday to fly back to Zimbabwe, and so this was a Thursday night. I had basically a day, Friday, to organise something. So I tried to get lots of human rights organisations interested, but the only people I could find who were willing to try and do something were members of Outrage. And we decided, even though Mugabe is homophobic, we decided the more important issue to focus on at that time was his sanctioning of torture. And in particular, we had the case of two black journalists in Harare, Zimbabwe, who had been tortured on Mugabe's orders. And this was clearly against Britain's anti-torture laws and the United Nations Convention Against Torture. So it was a really strong legal case. So the plan was to try and seize him as he left his hotel, and then to hand him over to the police for prosecution. We decided to wait until the Saturday morning. We knew at some point he'd have to come out of the hotel to go shopping and then eventually to get to the airport for his flight that evening. So we lay in wait really early in the morning, not knowing what time he was going to leave. We lay in wait outside the hotel, trying to look inconspicuous. One of us was in a telephone box, pretending to make telephone calls. Another was looking in a shop window. Another was reading a newspaper at the bus stop. Plus we brought with us an independent journalist, photographer, and video person, so that everything could be recorded independently to see what happened. After about 2 hours, this is probably about 10:30, the concierge to the hotel, St James's Court Hotel, the guy with the top hat and tails who greets VIPs, we noticed he was staying on the steps and looking at us. So obviously he'd noticed our presence for the preceding 2 or 3 hours. So I began to get worried that, he might be suspicious and alert the police, or who knows what happened. The next shot, what happened was that some minutes later, from the side entrance, where all the VIP apartments are, a number, about 6 or 7, maybe 5 or 6 or 7, African-looking guys emerged and started pointing at us. And I thought to myself, at this stage, we had no idea really whether the call on the Thursday night was a hoax or not. We were operating on the assumption it was true. And we had no idea whether Mugabe was in the hotel at that time or whatever. But I thought to myself, these are probably his security detail. And they'll probably come out because the concierge has alerted them to the fact that these people have been outside for 2.5, 3 hours. So they started looking and pointing in our direction. I thought, if they are suspicious, Mugabe won't come out, or not until the security people have called the police to at least get us checked out. And as soon as the police see me, they'll know something's up. So in those circumstances, to try and arrest a head of state, which is a very serious thing to do, knowing that he's got bodyguards who probably wouldn't be too ungenerous with their fists, and maybe armed with weapons. I can remember I was shaking, and my stomach was churning over. I had the urge, I was so nervous, I had the urge to urinate and defecate, perhaps to hold it all in. I had a splitting headache from the nervous tension. And when I saw these African guys, I thought, oh, it's all over now. They'll call the police. It'll all go down the Swanee. But amazingly, somehow, I had a brilliant idea. So I smiled, gave a full smile, and walked across the road straight to where these African guys were and said, "Hi, guys. I'm from the News of the World. And these are my photographers and my fellow journalists. We're here because we have a tip-off that Elton John is in the hotel with his new boyfriend. We've got to get the story for tomorrow's paper. We've got to get the story. Can you please help us? Which room is he in?" They shook their heads. I said, "I'll give you £50 if you tell us what room he's in. I'll give you £75. I'll give you £100. I only had £10 in my pocket. Anyway, they obviously were not buying it. So then I thought, I had another idea. I turned to one of them and said, "Look, you can't fool me. I know you. I was at the Elton John's Wembley concert 2 months ago. There hadn't been a concert 2 months prior. I was at Elton John's concert 2 months ago. You were there, part of his security detail. I remember seeing you. If Elton John wasn't in the hotel, you wouldn't be here. So please, come on, £100, tell us which room he's in." And then this guy started speaking in Zimbabwean dialects, Shona or Nebadili, and they all burst out laughing, and then they walked off. I thought to myself, I think I might have convinced them. And sure enough, 10 minutes later, from the side entrance, out came President Mugabe in his limousine. I scratched the top of my head to indicate it's him in the car, and my colleagues further up the street, there were only 3 of them, but they ran directly in front of his speeding limousine, forcing it to halt, and then one ran behind the car so it couldn't go forward and couldn't go backward. Then I ran from the side and opened the left-hand rear door. Amazingly, it was unlocked, and there before me was the President of Zimbabwe. I reached inside and gently took his arm with this hand, then held out this hand to show I didn't have a weapon. He did have someone on the back seat with him, presumably a bodyguard, who was cowering in the corner. And Mugabe himself, I very quickly said, "President Mugabe, you are under arrest on charges of torture. I am now summoning the police." You should have seen the look on his face. He is very dark-skinned, but you could see a visible ashen pallor come across his face. His eyes popped and his jaw dropped. He recoiled in his seat and put up his hands. He looked like a frightened 10-year-old kid. And I remember thinking to myself, now you know what your victims feel like. Only we aren't going to torture or kill you. you're going to have a chance to defend yourself in a court of law. Anyway, we then summons the police. The police came, we told them who was in the car, they were absolutely gobsmacked, as you can imagine, and we showed them the legal papers, the clear legal evidence that President Mugabe had authorized the torture of these two men in Zimbabwe, which is a criminal offence under British law and the United Nations Convention Against Torture. The police knocked the papers out of our hands and they tried to arrest us. Initially there were only 3 officers and there were 4 of us. So it took 2 officers to remove each person. So they dragged us out from under the car and put us on the pavement. Then went back to get another person, but then the person on the pavement ran back and stood in front of the car again. This went on for another few minutes until more reinforcements arrived. In the end, we were taken to Belgravia police station and President Mugabe was given a police escort to go Christmas shopping at Harrods. The police didn't know what to charge us with. They were talking about a whole range of things. Criminal damage, that was completely false. Assaulting the police, complete fabrication. Obstructing the highway, well, perhaps technically yes. But also quite serious charges like riot and affray, which can carry many years imprisonment. In the end, we were bailed to return to the police station, and some weeks later, we stood trial. On the opening day of the trial, our defence team made it clear that every single incident had been recorded on video camera by the people we'd taken with us, and that we had an independent photographer and journalist who we would call as witnesses, who saw everything, and that we would show that approximately 15 police officers were apparently prepared to perjure themselves. There was a brief adjournment, and the next thing we know, all the charges are withdrawn and we were free to go. We didn't arrest President Mugabe, but that attempt made headlines around the world, and it shone a light on his human rights abuses. The response from people inside Zimbabwe was almost all the same. This was 1999, when email wasn't that popular and wasn't that big, certainly not in Zimbabwe. But in the weeks afterwards, I received approximately 5,000 email messages from people in Zimbabwe, and as I said, they all said more or less the same thing. We thought no one knew. We thought no one cared. Thank you for taking a stand. We couldn't do it here, but you've done it there. So psychologically and emotionally, it was a huge boost for people in Zimbabwe who are fighting for democracy and human rights. There's just a few snapshots of some of the things I've done over the years. My view is, if I can do it, anyone can. As I said, I came from the most unlikely background, with no background or experience or mentors, but I've done my bit. Together, of course, with many thousands of others who I've been privileged and honoured to work with. So, for me, the battle continues. 50 years is quite a stretch, but I think I've got another 30 years in me. I don't intend to give up now. And I hold the same idealism as I had all those years ago, 50 years ago. I want to see and believe I can work with others to help achieve a better world for all of us. That we don't have to accept the way the world is. We can make it better. And if we each do something, all the little somethings add up to effective social change. Thank you.